Open any copy of Matthew's Gospel to chapter 1. Give yourself 30 seconds. You will find 40 names in 17 verses. Most readers skip the chapter entirely. Genealogies feel like the assembly instructions nobody reads before opening the box. Don't skip this one. There are 5 women buried in this list, 5 women in 40 names, and every single one of them has what a first-century Jewish reader would have called a problem. Not a minor problem, not a cultural quirk, or a historical footnote. Each of these women is attached to a story involving prostitution or adultery or foreign ancestry that legally excluded her from the assembly of Israel, or a pregnancy that nobody could explain cleanly. The question is not simply why Matthew included women in a genealogy. Women occasionally appear in ancient genealogies. The question is why these 5? Why not Sarah, the wife of Abraham, who launched the covenant? Why not Rebekah, who navigated the transfer of the blessing to Isaac? Why not Leah, who bore 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel, and whose body is buried in the cave at Machpelah alongside Abraham and Sarah? Those women were the obvious choices. Every synagogue in Matthew's audience knew their names. Matthew skipped every single one of them. Instead, he chose Tamar, a Canaanite woman who disguised herself as a prostitute and slept with her father-in-law. He chose Rahab, a sex worker from Jericho who betrayed her own city to the enemy. He chose Ruth, a Moabite widow whose people were explicitly forbidden by Mosaic law from entering the assembly of Israel. He chose a woman he does not even name. He refers to her only as the wife of Uriah, and the refusal to name her is deliberate and pointed. And he chose Mary, a young woman from Nazareth found pregnant before her wedding night. Count what these 5 women have in common. Each one was, at some point, publicly suspected or accused. Each one's story involved a union the surrounding community would have found scandalous, impossible to explain, or legally problematic. Each one arrived in the messianic line through circumstances that convention would have excluded. That pattern is not accidental. Matthew built it deliberately into the first 17 verses of his gospel. He is making an argument before he narrates a single miracle, before the angel visits Joseph, before the star appears, before the Magi arrive from the east. The argument concerns what kind of Messiah has come, and it begins with 5 women most pastors treat as footnotes. Before we get to each one, mark this detail. Matthew does not name Bathsheba. He calls her the wife of Uriah. That deliberate omission is a clue we will return to. Hold the name Uriah. The first woman in Matthew's genealogy is Tamar. She appears in verse 3. Tamar was a Canaanite woman, a foreigner, who married Judah's eldest son, a man named Genesis chapter 38 describes as wicked in the sight of the Lord, and says God took his life. Under the levirate law of the ancient Near East, when a man died without a son, his brother was required to marry the widow and produce an heir in the dead man's name. Tamar was given to Judah's second son, Onan. Onan also died. Judah then had one son remaining, Shelah, and he sent Tamar back to her father's house with a promise. Wait until Shelah is old enough, and she would be given to him. Judah had no intention of keeping that promise. He was afraid of losing a third son. So he stalled. Tamar waited. Shelah grew to manhood. Judah still did not send for her. What Tamar did next is one of the most legally precise and ethically complicated acts in the Hebrew Bible. She learned that Judah was traveling to Timnah to shear his sheep. She removed her widow's clothes, garments that marked her as unavailable, put on a veil, and sat by the road at a place called Enaim. Judah mistook her for a cult prostitute and propositioned her. She agreed in exchange for his seal, his cord, and his staff, his identifying marks, the ancient equivalent of a notarized signature. 3 months later, when Tamar's pregnancy became visible and was reported to Judah, he ordered her burned. Tamar produced his seal, cord, and staff. Judah's response in Genesis 38, verse 26, is 4 words in Hebrew, tzadka, mimeni he. She is more righteous than I. He did not say she was forgiven. He did not say the situation was regrettable. He declared her more righteous than himself. She had enforced a legal right. He had denied her. The scandal by the text's own verdict belonged to Judah. Yet Tamar is the woman Matthew names in verse 3, not Judah's lawful wives, not the mothers of the other tribes. Tamar, the foreign woman who had to outwit a patriarch to receive what the law already owed her. The second woman is Rahab. She appears in verse 5. Rahab was a zonah, a Hebrew word with no ambiguity in the text, consistently translated as prostitute. She lived in a house built directly into the wall of Jericho, the heavily fortified Canaanite city that stood between the Israelites and the land they had been promised. When Joshua sent 2 spies to scout the city before the assault, Rahab hid them under stalks of flax drying on her roof, then lied to the king's soldiers about their location and sent them off in the wrong direction. Her reasoning was explicit and strategic. She told the spies in Joshua chapter 2, I know that the Lord has given this land to you. She had heard about the parting of the Red Sea 40 years earlier. She had heard about the defeat of Sihon and Og east of the Jordan. She made a calculated assessment of the evidence and chose the side she believed would prevail. The spies promised that anyone inside her house when the city fell would be spared. Identified by a scarlet cord, she was to hang in her window. Excavations at Tel es-Sultan, the site identified as ancient Jericho, have uncovered something consistent with the architecture Rahab's account describes. Archaeologist John Garstang, excavating the site between 1930 and 1936, found a section of the northern city wall where houses had been built directly against the outer fortification. A portion of that northern wall did not fall when the rest of the city's perimeter collapsed. The localized survival of one section, precisely where houses on the wall would have stood, matches the text's claim with geographic specificity. Rahab survived. She married an Israelite named Salmon. Their son was Boaz. And Boaz's story brings us to the third woman. Ruth was a Moabite. This is a legal problem Matthew expects his readers to recognize immediately. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3 reads, No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter. Ruth was not a 10th generation Moabite who had diluted her ancestry over decades. She was a first generation Moabite widow, as recently Moabite as a person could be. Her husband, an Israelite named Mahlon, had died in Moab, leaving Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi stranded. Naomi released her daughters-in-law to return to their own families. Ruth refused. The book of Ruth is built around a Hebrew word that recurs through the text. Hesed, covenant loyalty, the faithfulness that holds even when no law requires it. And Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi, at personal cost and with no legal obligation, is the first demonstration of it. The word is usually translated loving kindness in English. That translation is not wrong, but it flattens the legal weight of the original. Hesed is what a soldier owes a commander. It is what a subject owes a king. Ruth demonstrated it to a destitute foreign widow. That is the scandal of the word in this context. When Ruth arrived in Bethlehem and began gleaning grain in Boaz's field, the legal provision Moses established for widows and foreigners, Boaz noticed her and asked his workers who she was. They told him. He had already heard about her, he said, toward Naomi. He told his workers to leave grain deliberately. He invited her to eat at his table. When Ruth later approached Boaz at the threshing floor and invoked the Levirate law, Boaz called her a woman of Hiel, valor, the Hebrew word used elsewhere for soldiers of fighting courage, and extended the covenant to a woman the law technically excluded from it. Their son was Obed. Obed's son was Jesse. Jesse's son was David. The Moabite widow, who should have been excluded to the 10th generation, became the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. Now look at the fourth woman in the genealogy, or rather, look at what Matthew writes, and what he refuses to write. Verse 6 says, David became the father of Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah. He does not say Bathsheba. Every first-century reader knew who the wife of Uriah was. The story of David and Bathsheba was among the most famous in Israel's history. Matthew is not withholding information. He is choosing words with precision. Codex Sinaiticus, the 4th century Greek parchment manuscript now held at the British Library, and one of the 2 oldest complete New Testament manuscripts in existence, preserves Matthew 1 verse 6 with this exact phrasing, Ectis tu Uriu, from the one of Uriah. Codex Vaticanus, the 4th century manuscript housed in the Vatican Library, agrees word for word. This is not a scribal variant introduced later. It is original. Uriah the Hittite was not an Israelite. He was a foreigner, identified twice in the text by his ethnic origin. He was also one of David's 30 fighting elite, the catalog of David's most loyal warriors in 2 Samuel chapter 23. When David committed adultery with Uriah's wife, and she became pregnant, David tried to cover the situation by recalling Uriah from the battlefield. Uriah refused to go home and sleep in his own bed while his comrades were still camped in the field. David got him drunk. Uriah still refused. David then sent him back to the front with sealed orders for his own execution, which Uriah, faithful to the last, carried himself to his commanding officer. When Matthew writes, the wife of Uriah, he forces every reader to hold that name, not just David's sin, the phrase implies it, but Uriah's fidelity. The loyal Hittite soldier who died faithfully while the king of Israel betrayed him is embedded permanently in the genealogy of the Messiah. You cannot pass Bathsheba's entry without thinking about the man who died in her place. 4 women, 4 irregularities. 4 women connected to foreign blood, Tamar the Canaanite, Rahab the Canaanite, Ruth the Moabite, Bathsheba the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Not one of them comes from the clean center of Israelite lineage. Now watch the Greek text of Matthew 1. Specifically, watch the verb. 39 times across the genealogy, Matthew uses the same Greek construction, egenesin, an active verb meaning begat, with a clear subject performing a clear action. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Judah. The pattern holds across 15 verses, 39 consecutive repetitions. It is relentless, almost rhythmic. Then verse 16 breaks it. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. The verb shifts to a genithi, passive voice, was born, not Joseph begat. The Greek pronoun translated of whom is unambiguously singular and feminine. It refers to Mary alone, not to both Mary and Joseph. To Mary, Raymond E. Brown, in The Birth of the Messiah, published by Doubleday in 1993, argued that this grammatical break was Matthew's structural announcement of the virgin birth, embedded in the genealogy's verb pattern before the birth narrative begins 2 verses later. 39 active verbs, and then 1 passive. The break in the pattern is the theological claim. Matthew announces the miracle through grammar before he narrates it in plain language. Now set that passive verb next to the 4 women who came before Mary. Brown's analysis identifies the quality that connects Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba to each other, and to Mary. Each of them was involved in a union that appeared, from the outside, scandalous, irregular, or legally impossible. Each was vulnerable to public accusation, and in every case, what looked like scandal from the outside turned out to be the channel through which the messianic line advanced. Notice what the text actually says about each of them. Tamar is not condemned. Judah declares her more righteous than himself. Rahab is not abandoned. Her household survives, and she enters the lineage of Israel's greatest king. Ruth is not excluded. Boaz calls her a woman of valor, and the community blesses her at the city gate. Bathsheba is not erased. Her son becomes king, and in 1 Kings chapter 1, her voice secures the succession. The text does not treat these women as cautionary tales. It treats them as participants in a deliberate method. Compare what Matthew does here with what Luke does. Luke's genealogy in chapter 3 traces the line backward from Jesus all the way to Adam, emphasizing the universal scope of the gospel, connecting Jesus to all humanity. Luke includes no women. His genealogy is clean, formal, patrilineal. Matthew's genealogy, by contrast, is built around disruptions, foreigners, irregular unions, a passive verb at verse 16 that breaks 39 repetitions of the same active form. Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience, probably in the 80s of the first century, in a community still navigating what it means that the Messiah arrived in this particular form through this particular family. The objections he anticipates are first-century objections. This man's lineage is irregular. His birth cannot be explained. His family tree contains scandal. Matthew's response is not to deny the scandal. His response is, look at the tree. Read the names Matthew left out. Sarah is absent. Rebekah is absent. Leah, mother of 6 tribes, is absent. Rachel, the beloved wife of Jacob, is absent. These women are theologically uncomplicated, legally unimpeachable, above reproach. That is precisely why they do not appear. Matthew needed the women whose inclusion required explanation. He needed the women who demonstrated that God had, across Israel's entire recorded history, consistently advanced the covenant through circumstances that conventional piety would have rejected. Not occasionally, consistently. Here is the verdict. Matthew chapter 1 is not simply a genealogy, it is a brief, a legal argument addressed to readers who know these 5 stories and who are already formulating objections to the claim that Jesus is the Messiah. Matthew is not apologizing for these women. He is presenting them as precedent. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba are his case law. They are prior rulings. They are his evidence that the divine method has always operated this way, through the foreign, the accused, the irregular, the unexplainable, through people that polite genealogical convention would have excluded. And then Mary arrives, an engaged woman found pregnant, a betrothed man planning to divorce her quietly, a community that would have drawn the obvious conclusion. From the outside, Mary's story matches the profile of every story Matthew has already cataloged. That is not a problem to explain away. That is the point. The Greek term Matthew uses to open the chapter, Biblos Geneseos, book of the genealogy, is the same phrase the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible uses in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, to introduce the genealogy of Adam. Matthew is invoking the authority of the oldest text in the tradition. He is saying, this is a new beginning, and the new beginning looks exactly like every prior beginning. Strange, operating outside expected boundaries, running through people the gatekeepers would have turned away. Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, the 2 oldest complete manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, preserve this genealogy intact. Every name, every verb, the passive erenethi in verse 16, the phrase wife of Uriah in verse 6, the 5 women. Matthew was not trying to bury the scandal. He was displaying it. He built the first argument of the entire gospel around it. Before you read the angel appearing to Joseph in a dream, before you read the star rising over Bethlehem, before you read anything that requires you to believe something you have never seen before, Matthew has already told you what kind of Messiah this is. He arrives through Tamar, who was nearly burned, through Rahab, who hung a scarlet cord in the wall of a falling city, through Ruth, who should have been excluded by law, but was declared a woman of valor, through a woman Matthew will not even name, because the name he wants you to carry is Uriah, and then through Mary, who fit every pattern that preceded her. 5 women, each a scandal, 1 argument. On the first page, which of these 5 women do you think Matthew most wanted his original readers to recognize? And what does your answer tell you about what he was arguing? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.